Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and in this one I'm going to go over my round 3 game from the Washington Chess Congress. Now if you followed the round 2 video, you know that I drew a tough game against International Master Oladapo Adu, and I may have had some chances with white in the end game, but I didn't manage to find the right path, and so I was hoping to play a little bit better in this game and put more pressure on an opponent I knew was going to be lower rated than me, because in an open, when you draw, you tend to play someone around the same level or lower. It turned out my opponent was a FIDE master by the name of Andrew Samuelson, and at the time his rating was around 2100, so he clearly had dropped quite a bit from his peak, but class, doesn't tend to go away. So even though someone might be in or out of form and not be as active and so on, if someone has gotten to a particular level, you can't take them for granted. So I certainly was not taking my opponent for granted, and was just hoping to bring some good energy to this one. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I was black, and Andrew opened with e4. I was able to check really quickly on my phone before the game started that he actually was an e4 player, and that's pretty much the extent of what I knew. Again, in these tournaments, you'll really get the pairings like 5 minutes before, and so I could just check my phone really quickly and then give it to the basically the organizers, the arbiters, because obviously you can't have any electronics on you while you play. So yeah, I saw he played e4, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to try out the Caro-Kann. So I went for c6, and then d4, d5, and I had no idea which variation of the Caro-Kann he played. So it was a pleasant surprise, actually, when he played the move e5. And e5 is, in my opinion, the most challenging move against the Caro-Kann, but it's also one of the more dynamic lines, so black has really good counterattacking chances in the setup. Now, there's two ways for black to handle the advanced variation. One is to play c5, and one is to play bishop f5. I've employed both of those lines this year, and in this game, I decided to play bishop f5. White now went knight f3. I went e6, and now bishop e2 was played, and this is all normal so far. This has been played at least 1,000 times, probably more than that. And the point is that white's basically castling quickly, keeping the space advantage, and typically then reroutes this knight to b3 to try and put a stranglehold on the c5 break. Typically, black, on the other hand, plays knight d7, knight e7, some combination of those, and either prepares for c5 or slow plays it a little bit more with h6 or knight c8 or sometimes h6 and g5. And the nature of the closed position actually gives black and white luxuries about where they want to put their pieces, and particularly gives them some time to maneuver. So that's pretty much what wound up happening. So I went knight e7. And white actually went c3 first, and this is actually a relatively new move that's been played in the last, I'd say, 5 years or so. And the idea in many lines is actually to reinforce the center right away, and it's actually quite a challenging move because in a lot of lines, black wants to play a quick c5. And in circumstances where black does not recover the pawn on the very next move after d takes c5 with a move like bishop takes c5, a lot of times white has the liberty of playing knight d4, which attacks the bishop on f5 and actually puts some pressure on the c6 pawn after a bishop b5 check. So, for instance, if I played c5 now, after d takes e5, this knight d4 move is a little bit annoying because it's clear that I'm not recovering the pawn on the very next move, right? I can't win the c5 pawn right now, and so let's say I played like a move like knight e c6, well, now white might have the option of playing b4 because c3 has been played, and white also might have the option of playing knight d4, hitting the bishop on f5. So that's kind of one of the merits of playing c3. So against c3, I actually decided to play h6 and not go for c5 breaks, and now white actually castled, and I went knight d7. And this is actually kind of another standard plan in this position, as you put the knights on e7 and d7. You play h6 to give your bishop a retreating square if knight h4 harasses it. And you kind of just wait to see how white is going to set up a little bit. White now played the move knight bd2. And now we're pretty much back in the knight bd2 lines of this variation, where the only difference is that white has played c3 here. There are lines where the pawn is still on c2, and white has played knight b3. And so just to show you what that looks like, if c3 wasn't played, let's say castles, knight d7, knight d2. Now h6 is normally played because there's no bishop e4 anymore because the knight's guarding that square. And then knight b3. Here in this position, there are actually many moves. I've seen black play a6, rook c8, but a move that actually a lot of people like to play that's quite dynamic and trendy is actually g5. And the point is that you take space on the king side, and in some lines you actually have the liberty to keep your king in the center, castle king side, or even castle queen side, and then it's a really full-fledged fight. And one of the merits of this type of setup for black is that white doesn't necessarily have an immediate pawn break, because the move c4 is actually a move that black would be quite happy with, because after d takes c4, the knight would actually get the d5 square. So yeah, typically white would go like knight e1, knight d3, try and maneuver towards the c5 square, and also prepare for f4. But yeah, so basically we had a very similar position. The difference is that c3 is on the board instead of knight b3. And I was trying to kind of like gauge the differences in the setups, like what's the difference between the knight not being on b3 yet? Can I get away with c5 here or not? And I actually wound up playing the move bishop h7 because I wasn't so sure whether I could play c5 or not. Again, the thing that I was kind of concerned about is if I play c5, d takes c5, and knight c6, perhaps there's some issue with knight d4 hitting this bishop on f5. But actually, now that I look at it, this actually seems kind of playable to me, because I can now retreat the bishop, and in these positions, I have a scenario where both the e5 and c5 pawns are hanging, so it doesn't look too bad for black. In fact, it looks quite decent. So maybe an argument could have been made that I should have played c5 here instead of dropping the bishop back. But I dropped the bishop back and just trying to wait and just see what white was going to do. And white now played the move knight b3, and I think this is actually kind of a better version of the position for white, because if you basically include the move c3 and bishop h7, I think white actually strengthened their position a little bit more than I did. And I didn't get in this pawn break now, and now it's going to be harder and harder to get off. I now thought about, maybe still trying to play for c5. So I went for the move rook c8, trying to kind of play c5 with all the ideal trappings, if you will, without having knight d4 hit my bishop on f5. Essentially just without having to sack a pawn, just essentially getting it back right away, and just really kind of just telegraphing the idea. But this probably was not a good decision, because white can actually kind of reinforce their piece against it. Instead, knight f5 was a little bit better and more in the vein of my last few moves, because at least now there's a justification for my bishop being pulled back to h7, the fact that now my knight would be on that square. And on a lot of lines, the bishop on c1 likes to actually go to e3, so where it continues to eye the c5 square. So at least with my knight on f5, I'm actually discouraging white from doing that. So this would probably have been a better choice. White could go bishop d3, pinning the knight to the bishop on h7, and I could go bishop g6 back. And yeah, we have a little bit of an interesting position where, it's kind of dynamic. I haven't played for the break, and, white has to come up with a plan. So I'm going to be ready to play bishop e7 and castle. And yeah, I think white is a little bit better, but nothing serious. Instead, I played this rook c8 move, and it kind of took me down this rabbit hole that was probably not very good, because now white played the move knight e1, and essentially white is just trying to gear up towards the c5 break, and also entertains the idea of playing f4. And if white gets an f4, the pawn e5 is even more solidified. So I thought this was like my one last chance to try to play for c5, but I wasn't sure if the timing made sense. I did decide to play c5, but this move was extremely double-edged, and one can argue if it was correct, because the position I got was actually not very good. I could have also opted for knight f5 again, and then if knight d3, bishop e7. But I should say that, white is clearly better here. I mean, this knight on f5 can potentially be driven away at some point with g4, and this pawn avalanche could be kind of dangerous. Also, with the knights on d3 and b3, you can see how c5 is clamped down on quite efficiently. And, yeah, there's some problems to solve here. So I decided to play c5 and, try to solve my problems at once. White played knight takes e5. I took back with the knight, and after d takes e5, I went knight c6. And basically, this is in part a little bit of the start of my troubles, because a little bit better would have probably been rook takes c5. Now, the reason I didn't like rook takes c5 is because I was worried about queen a4 check ideas or bishop e3 ideas, and in both variations, I thought my a7 pawn was a little bit loose. But actually, after queen a4 check, queen d7, queen takes a7, and knight c6. Black's actually quite active here, and after queen a8 check, knight d8, even though, black is down a pawn, black's pawn structure is pretty healthy, and this bishop is pretty decent on the long diagonal. It's not the end of the world, although, white is quite a bit better here. After a4, rook c8, queen a7, white's better here, but black can kind of fight a little bit more dynamically. I could go bishop c5 now, challenge the queen again, follow up with castles, and again, even though white is up a pawn here, black is kind of active once this knight gets back to c6. Note that with the bishop on this diagonal, the pawn on f2 is kind of frozen and can't protect the e5. It can't protect the e5 pawn. So yeah, I think it was just basically the c5 break put me in a tough position where, do I want to play rook takes c5 and get my rook out kind of open? I would much rather prefer to take the pawn with the bishop on c5, because that would get me closer to castling. And so that's why I played the move knight c6. So anyways, after knight c6, white played b4. And this was kind of a move that I just underestimated, in part because usually in these structures, when you play b4 to reinforce the pawn on c5, you create so many weaknesses in the structure that it's actually not really worth the trouble, because typically there's a5 as a move that can kind of undermine this pawn chain. And really, at the end of the day, even though these pawns are protecting each other, they're usually quite immobile. What I mean by that is if you play b5, all of a sudden c5 is super weak, and if you push c4, then b4 is weak. So typically the pawns are targets, and it's not such a big deal. But the problem here is because my king isn't castled, these pawn pushes actually are extremely dangerous. And so, encouraging white playing b5 or something like this actually is not so great for me, because I might just get overrun in the center. The other thing is that typically when you undermine the pawn structure with a5, after a3, black usually tends to win a pawn because the rook on a1 is still unprotected. But the issue here is that because the rook has already gone to c8, I don't actually have tactical chances against the unprotected rook on a1. So there's no a5, a takes b4, and knight takes b4, which is sometimes the case when there's tension on the a file. So those differences make this b4 move totally legitimate and make it really, really difficult for me. So I thought for a while here and kind of recognized that, I was kind of in some trouble and may very well not win the pawn back when I have to play for compensation. But in the end, I decided to play knight takes e5, basically because I didn't see a real justification for not, getting my material back. If I play a move like bishop e7, white can actually play a3 and, again, firmly hold on to this pawn. And, okay, maybe not play a3 right away. Maybe reinforce the pawn on e5 first. So maybe after bishop e7, knight f3 is a little bit better. But then eventually a3 will come. So let's say castles a3. And essentially this structure is just a pawn up for white. And I don't have a brilliant way to undermine it, because if I play a move like a5, I'm not actually threatening anything, because my rook is not on a8. And yeah, it's just not a good pawn tension for me. So basically I thought I needed to get this pawn on e5 just not to be clearly a pawn down with no compensation. But I recognize that grabbing the pawn would be extremely risky and, yeah, probably not correct. So after knight takes e5, white actually played queen a4 check. That's very logical. And again, that's the issue with my king still on e8, is that this diagonal tactically is very, very sensitive. I now went knight c6 back, and it wasn't a move I was thrilled with, but I felt like I needed to do it. Note that, queen d7 just runs into bishop b5 pins, which seemed unpleasant. Also, there's just queen takes a7 as a free pawn, so that's also kind of important. So after knight c6, white actually went knight f3, and you could see here that, the material is equal. I've recovered my pawn, but the pressure on this diagonal and my king still going on e8 means that white is just better here. And it's really going to be difficult just to survive the next few moves, because knight d4 and bishop b5 comes quite quickly. I played bishop e7, just trying to castle, and now white played the move knight e5, trying to get at the c6 knight. And now I played bishop f6. One of the things that, I was aware of is that if I castle, I thought knight takes c6. Well, if I play rook takes c6, there's queen takes a7, and I'm just down a pawn, and b7 is hanging. And if I play b takes a6, there's bishop a6. And after rook c7, there's bishop f4. And essentially, my bishop is getting cut to pieces, or excuse me, my rook is getting cut to pieces by this bishop pair, and I'm either going to lose the exchange or lose a very important pawn on c6. So I thought that it would be a little bit better to at least put the bishop on f6 right away, because if I lose the exchange, at least my bishop is eyeing this pawn on c3. So I thought it was just a slightly better move order. Because now white did play knight takes c6, and after b takes a6, white played bishop f4. And the point was that if you go bishop a6, my plan was actually to go bishop takes c3. And here it appears I'm losing an exchange, but it's really only temporary, because my bishop's here now taking away squares from the a1 rook. And also, I actually have quite decent compensation based upon the fact that I have a really healthy central pawn structure. So essentially, in many different lines, I can actually give up the exchange if I have a very decent pawn structure, because it makes it difficult for the white rooks to maneuver. And so it is even an open debate whether it'd be worth it to actually try to give up this bishop to recover my exchange in certain positions, given the fact that my bishops control the center so well. So anyways, after b takes c6, bishop f4 is played. And this is, a very reasonable move, because now the rook on a1 isn't trapped and is free to maneuver around, and bishop a6 is still a really reasonable idea. So I decided to castle here. I thought this was the most responsible move. The computer's suggesting that I can play e5, actually, but I thought e5 was kind of suspicious just because I'm blocking my bishop on the long diagonal, and I thought that was where my counterplay was coming from. A computer line goes e5, bishop g3, and actually castles and just saying that give up the a7 pawn. But after queen takes a7, I was not so sure if I had full comp here. The line goes d4, which I think is kind of difficult to play if you're not totally sure of your compensation to trade more pieces. But after cd4, queen takes d4, and the argument here is that this queen is hitting b4. I'm actually threatening rook a8 now, and these rooks that are connected could harass the queen on a7. And apparently, black has really good compensation here, but I just did not like the idea of my bishop being shut down on this diagonal. So instead, I decided to castle right away. And really, this invites white to win the exchange, because my rook does not have squares here or here, and bishop a6 is a very legitimate move. So white actually played bishop a6, going for this exchange now. And I just played bishop takes c3 and said, you know what? You can have the exchange, but I'm going to have these two bishops and, a central pawn majority, and I was hoping that that would kind of offset the exchange to a certain extent. Although I recognized here that, white was probably significantly better, because basically the alternative just didn't work. If I play rook a8, now white can just play bishop b7, or queen takes c6, and in both scenarios, the c6 pawn is going to be lost, and then the c5 pawn is actually the most dangerous pawn on the board because it's the furthest advanced. So it just really did not make sense to me at all to just put my rook into this inactive position when it's going to be lost anyway. And, I mean, white can even start with a move like rook c1 here, defending the c3 pawn and renewing the threats of queen takes c6 and bishop b7. So, yeah, so basically I was very, very keen to not allow some type of position like this where I'm extremely passive. So I decided to give up the exchange, and after bishop takes c3, white actually played rook ac1 first, just forcing my bishop off the line. I now went bishop b2, but I actually had some decisions to make here, and there were other alternatives that were worth thinking about. I also looked at queen f6, attacking the f4 bishop and defending the c3 one, but I didn't like bishop d6 in certain lines, and I didn't like that my queen was straying too far from the queenside pawn, so that's why I didn't go for this. But it turns out the computer really likes the move d4. And the point is, after bishop takes c8 and queen takes c8, this bishop is kind of anchored really nicely by the d4 pawn, and the rooks don't really have open files to work with because this one is covering b1. And so after rook fd1, a6, and queen b3, black can actually play bishop e4 now and get this bishop to the d5 square. And this is actually something that is a really, really important maneuver to just be aware of, because if I rerouted my bishop to that d5 square, I'd be blocking off another important potential open file, and I would be protecting my pawns quite decently and eyeing the pawn on g2. So the bishop on d5 would just be perfectly placed, and I missed an opportunity to get it there. I think the other thing that makes this so good is because in a lot of lines, white is going to probably have to wind up giving back the exchange. And so if a position like rook takes e3, d takes e3, queen takes e3 really does give the rook on d1 and the bishop on d6 some counterplay along the d file. But if I'm able to get my bishop to d5, I'm able to shut that down. And so that's another important reason why it's a good way to play. So unfortunately, I missed that one, and I think part of the reason is I didn't want to push a pawn further ahead and separate these guys a little bit and weaken the chain, but yeah, d4 was the best move. Instead, I went bishop b2, attacking the rook on c1, and now white went rook ce1, trying to keep the exchange and essentially not just trying to remain an exchange up. But I thought it was a little bit weird for the rook to go to e1, which meant that the rook on f1 would be extremely passive. And so there are already lines where maybe bishop d3 could recover the exchange. I played queen d7 now. Again, I'm just kind of willing to give up the exchange at this point. I didn't see any reasonable way to defend it, so I was like, now or never, take the exchange. And now white finally did with the move bishop takes c8, but actually, white could have held up a little bit more and improved his pieces a little bit with the move bishop d6. And this would have been extremely annoying for me because essentially now both my rooks are attacked. I'm still going to lose in an exchange. And the bishop on d6 cuts my queen off from the d file where I might have been hoping for some counterplay. So this is actually a much, much better move. I'd probably need to go d4 anyway. And after bishop takes f8, rook takes f8, you actually keep the bishop that's actually more important on the board. And the reason this bishop on a6 was more important than the one on f4 is because this one on a6 actually threatens my weakest pawn, the c6 pawn, in many lines. And so I have to be very, very concerned about bishop b7 ideas or even b5 ideas, just advancing the pawn to allow the c pawn to become passed. So this type of maneuver would have been infinitely better than what Andrew actually did because he would have retained the better bishop. Instead, Andrew played bishop takes c8, and after rook takes c8, I actually finally have some light square control again in my position because these squares have the potential now to be covered. White played the move rook e3, shifting the rook to the third rank, and it's actually quite a decent move because it entertains threats on two fronts. It entertains ideas of pressure along the g-file, and it introduces plans like rook b3, playing for a lever, b5 lever of essentially trying to make the c-pawn pass. So it's actually a very decent multi-purpose move. And here, I played the move queen b7, trying to cover those light squares that were now somewhat vacated by the exchange of white's light squared bishop, and essentially just trying to get that blockade going with a6 and rook a8 or something along those lines. If I get an a6, I feel a lot less worried about the b5 break. White now went rook g3, eyeing the g7 square, and it's something I have to be worried about because already bishop takes h6 is a threat, just trying to win a pawn. And yeah, I mean, my bishop on b2 is protecting the g7 pawn on that long diagonal, but you know, it's now at least white has some forces concentrated against my king. I played the move bishop g6, which I thought was a good multi-purpose move, both stopping the bishop takes h6 threat and also giving my king an escape square so I don't have back rank problems later. After bishop g6, white now played the move bishop d6, and this is another good move. Again, this bishop really does belong on this square where it really takes away squares on the 8th rank from me. And it's just a monster piece because it shuts down any counterplay I might have on the d-file with my d-pawn. The other thing that it does is it protects the c5 pawn. So when b5 does happen, c5 is actually now protected. So yeah, very, very good move, but definitely something that he should have played earlier with both bishops on the board. After bishop d6, I played the move rook a8, and my idea here was to just play a6 in some positions, and in an ideal world, I would love to play a6 and then queen b5 and trade the queens. So, for instance, just to give you a sample of what that would look like, let's say king h1, a6, king g1, queen b5, and then an exchange of queens. I know this isn't realistic, but this was like kind of like my dream position because my rook would control the one relevant open file. My bishops do a great job of controlling the entry squares for the rook on the first rank on the queen side. And in this particular circumstance, my c6 pawn isn't really a weakness because white's rooks don't have any meaningful ways to enter. And the bishop on d6 is actually kind of misplaced now because there's no real attack against my king. So this bishop might need to come back and start defending because I will start to advance my central pawns. So this was kind of like the dream scenario that I envisioned when playing rook a8. And I think here actually black would be the one in the driver's seat, or at least the one for choice in a position like this. Although I may be mistaken. It just seems to me a little bit more pleasant to play black right now. Instead of course, king h1, white actually played the move queen b3. But remarkably here, there was a line that I completely missed that really gives white really, really serious play. And it's actually the move rook b3. Now, I thought rook b3 just wasn't playable because of the move bishop c2. And I thought, you know, bishop c2 skewers the queen and on a4 and the rook on b3. And I thought, well, this is just, you know, going to be fine for me because I'm recovering an exchange. Amazingly here, white has the move b5, ignoring the loss of the exchange. And remarkably, the point is that after bishop takes b3, white actually has the move b takes c6. And all of a sudden, black's just lost. It would appear that black is temporarily a piece up, but you can see it if I take the queen now. C takes b7, and the b8 is next, and there's no way to stop that without just giving up the rook. So remarkably, the position is just completely lost, and yeah, just a very, very unique tactic where you're actually allowing me to take two heavy pieces in succession, but it doesn't matter. And in fact, because of that, because of the bishop c2 doesn't work because of b5, this is just a huge advantage for white because now b5 is just coming no matter what. So rook a8 was actually a blunder, but very difficult, I think, over the board to kind of truly understand why. But I think it just goes to show that you know, we both knew that b5 was an idea in this position, or was something that white was trying to angle for. And a lot of times you actually can play these moves that you're angling for tactically. And so every move you should actually be checking just to see if the idea works. And I think basically Andrew kind of didn't entertain b5 in a lot of these positions because, you know, it was defended twice. So, you know, just trying to think radically, sometimes you get to those solutions like this. But very, very remarkable tactic. Fortunately for me, instead of rook b3, white played the move queen b3, and this changes matters because now b5 still isn't in the cards, and I can play a6 next to, you know, fortify the b5 square. I, of course, played bishop f6 first, trying to just get my bishop out of harm's way. The computer suggests I should play bishop d4 instead, and the point is actually that after rook d1, I go e5 and keep the bishop in the center and advance my pawns a little bit. And I think this actually is an important lesson for me because you could see in several lines now, whether it was with my bishop on c3 and now with it on b2, there were opportunities for me to push either e5 or d4 to keep my bishop in the center, and I didn't do that because I didn't want to compromise the light squared pawn chain, when in actual fact the pawn chain, if it's not advanced, actually is quite powerless and does not create any counterplay. So it's actually important for me to push my pawns and create this counterplay, and I was just trying to be patient, which was actually the wrong approach. So after queen b3, I went bishop f6, and now white actually played a4, and now b5 is a very legitimate threat that I have to be worried about, so I played the move a6, temporarily keeping that under wraps, and white played the move rook c1. And you can see here that, you know, b5 is something I have to be worried about. You know, white may be revving up for that break. I now played bishop f5, and this decision was in part because I wanted to think about playing h5, h4, h3 and creating some light squared weaknesses, and I thought that the bishop on this diagonal would help to support that. The other reason actually was I thought in some positions, believe it or not, rook takes g6 might be an idea. So I actually wanted to kind of discourage that, and that's why I put the bishop on f5 where it couldn't be captured. There were some lines I was worried about where there was rook takes g6, f takes g6, and queen d3. And in positions where maybe the a6 pawn isn't defended well, I thought there could be some type of double attack down the road. So that was kind of my motivation there. There are also lines actually where there was rook takes g6 and queen c2, and in lines where the b5 breakthrough actually works, I saw some, you know, ghosts where there was like c6 coming with tempo against my queen, and then c7, and yeah, I basically did not want that. So the other thing that bishop f5 did in some positions is it actually covered the c8 square. Instead, again, the computer wants to move bishop d4 with the idea of playing e5, so go figure. Anyways, after bishop f5, white played f4, and this was actually a move that is very, very interesting and dynamic, covering the e5 square, but it was actually something I was extremely happy to see, because I thought that it really weakened the king side, in particular this diagonal and the second rank. And I thought that, you know, pushing the pawns around white's king would give me real counterplay whenever white actually gets the breakthrough b5. I thought my rook might get counterplay, maybe my queen could sneak around and get counterplay. So I was enthusiastic to see f4, but I wasn't so sure whether I should or not. It was just something that, whether I should be enthusiastic or not, it was just something that I thought was helpful to me, because now if I wanted to, my bishop could permanently anchor itself on e4 and not have to be harassed by f3. So anyways, after f4, I decided to play rook c8, just overprotecting the c6 pawn, and really ensuring that if b5 comes, c6 breakthrough is not really happening because I still have two defenders of that c6 square. After rook c8, white played h3, and this move kind of puzzled me, and I think in some ways validated my decision to kind of be patient, because in the past two moves now with f4 and h3, white is really, you know, making unnecessary weaknesses in his position, and I wasn't really I wasn't confident that white had a really decent plan. And so these moves kind of told me like white wasn't really sure of how to play on the queen side, because it's clear that white's advantage is on this side of the board, and he's not really pressing it effectively. And it's true. I mean, my bishops are very, very annoying, right? They're cutting on the diagonals very nicely. And so I do have pretty good compensation, but I just thought h3 was a bit slow. And now that h3 was played, I thought, well, why don't I try to fix this potential pawn on g2 with the move h5. And all of a sudden I got very, very excited, because I thought with h5 and h4, now the rook has to get off the g file where it was bothering my king, and then maybe the g pawn would be a backward pawn, which would mean that the king would kind of be stuck in a mating net in certain variations where my pawn is on h4 and the king is on h2. So all of a sudden I thought, you know what, I have ways to improve, and white is not really coming up with good ways to improve. White now played the move king h2, moving the king to the side, and really not stopping my idea of h4, because it's not possible. And then I went h4, and I thought, you know what, this is an accomplishment, this is an achievement, because it's very difficult to get at this pawn, and now I'm taking important space on the king side. After h4, white went rook f3, and now I played the move bishop e4. And I thought in the last few moves I'd made tremendous progress, because now my bishop is on an active square pointing towards the king. This h-pawn really does box the king in. And yeah, I thought I was actually taking over the initiative here. White now played rook e3, and I played the move bishop f5 back. Part of the reason for that is I was kind of concerned about rook takes e4 being a possibility, an exchange sacrifice trying to ruin my structure, because I didn't see a way to protect the e4 pawn. So let's say I make a move like king h8. I thought that rook takes e4, d takes e4, and rook e1 might be very strong, because white essentially gets a pawn for the exchange, and all of a sudden we would both have 6 pawns after the e4 pawn is off the board. But this bishop, I think, is a little bit better than my bishop on f6 because of the queenside pawn majority and the bishop supporting that majority. So I thought, you know what, don't allow that sacrifice, so just go back. After bishop f5, white actually went g4, and now he's like, oh my gosh, this guy is so bold. Like, why is he forcing the issue in this position on the king side? That's not where his strength lies. And so I was very, very surprised and kind of pleased to see this move, because I thought it just weakened white's whole king side setup. But I think I kind of underestimated some of the counterplay it created. So I took an en passant, of course, and after rook takes g3, I was like, okay, like the king now is kind of weak on h2 potentially, and h3 and f4 are split pawns. So in the past few moves, he's really weakened his pawn structure on the king side, and that's got to be good for me, right? So I played g6 first, just to kind of dissuade any ideas of attacking on the king side and doubling the rooks and just keeping my pawn structure kind of solid. And after g6, white played rook e3 back, and I was like, well, that's kind of strange. The rook was just on e3. What did he gain by playing rook g3 and then rook e3 back? Was it just worth it to have me push g6? I thought g6 helped my position, so it was just a weird thing to do. And here I was trying to figure out, okay, we're not quite at move 40 yet. At move 40, we'd get extra time. We'd get an extra half an hour, I believe, to think. And so I wanted to try and create some pressure on him before the time control, and I was trying to figure out which way to do that. I played king g7, and this was inspired by an idea to swing this rook over to h8 and get counterplay that way. And so, yeah, I thought, you know what, this is an interesting idea. And after king g7, white played queen a3, and I wasn't really sure what the queen a3 did, but I thought in some lines maybe rook b3 is the idea, trying to force through b5 like that. But I felt that this move was a little bit slow because it didn't seem to address my rook h8 idea. Here, though, I had a real opportunity to kind of loosen the screws in a really, really remarkable way, and I didn't see it, and instead went for my move rook h8. But I just have to show you some of these variations because they're simply remarkable. The best move in the position by quite a fair amount, actually, is the move d4. And it's kind of interesting because it doesn't seem like I can push the pawn much further. So it was kind of weird, strange to me why d4 is a good move. But the point is that actually after rook b3, I play rook e8. And the point is not actually to push the d-pawn much further, but the idea was actually to push the rook off of the e-file to actually play e5. And all of a sudden, if I'm actually able to open up one file for my rook and get rid of this f-pawn, all of a sudden the second rank and these diagonals for the bishops become terrifying. And so after rook e8, if white goes b5, I actually can go a takes b5, a takes b5, and actually e5. And this is something that looks extremely double-edged because you might ask, well, what if b6? Isn't this a pass pawn that's super dangerous? The bishop's supporting that square. The queen can come to a7. And once the queens come off the board, surely the b-pawn wins the game. Not so fast. After the move b6, I could play e takes f4. And after queen a7, black is actually winning. And the amazing, amazing line, very superhuman, is rook e2 check, king g1, and d3, giving up the queen for nothing. And the point is that if you play queen takes b7, bishop d4 check is actually mate, because if you go king h1, it's bishop e4 mate, and if you go king f1, it's bishop takes h3 mate. So remarkably, black's attack is just too fast, and it's really just the bishops and the rook just cutting up white's king into pieces. Amazing, amazing variation. And because of this move e takes f4, queen a7 obviously doesn't work. The only move here is actually rook g1, but my gosh, is that a hard move to see. Basically, and then after g5, the lines just get completely crazy. I mean, queen a7 again, queen c8 now, queen a2, d3, b7, queen e6, bishop takes f4, rook h8. It's just total madness. Rook g3 defending the h3 square because apparently b8 queen does not do the trick. And bishop e5, another crazy, just stunner of a move, just stunning. Because now if you play bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, rook takes h3 is a threat. So if like b8 queen, this actually wins, which is just insane. And so, yeah, so basically, instead queen b2 is the only move, pinning this queen so it can't move. But even here, there's rook takes h3, king g1, rook takes g3, king f2, queen b2, rook b2, and d2, remarkably, forcing through the queen, because if you play rook takes d2, there's rook b3 getting behind the pawn. And then queen e5 check, and king g6, king takes g3, and queen g4 check. And remarkably, in this position, black is for choice. My gosh, I mean, just the variations and the headache that would be required to kind of work this out to perfection is just beyond me. And but I thought it was just a really cool line to see, because it just goes to show that my instincts were correct about the king being weak and this h3 f4 pawn pushes from earlier being kind of suspect, but my execution was wrong. So yeah, who would have thought that I can just allow white to play b5 and b6? Not me. So anyways, after queen a3, I went rook h8. And I thought this was actually a really good move, because I thought that I was putting really good pressure on h3. And as long as there's pressure on the white king, it seemed to me extremely unrealistic that white would get a chance to play the b5 break, because he'd have to worry about more files being open behind. And yeah, I thought that honestly I was probably going to win this game. But the next sequence kind of shocked me. After rook h8, white played rook b3 anyway. And here, again, the best move is actually d4, but I did not play it. I played the move bishop e4, but just to show you what the lines look like now, if d4, b5, takes, d3 now, rook takes d3 is actually required because now that the rook is on h8, I'm actually threatening rook takes h3 in these lines. And so you have to take on d3. And then after queen takes b5, that's very important I capture there, because if I play bishop takes d3, there's b takes c6, which is a nice intermediate move, I think. So after queen takes b5, rook e3, and bishop b2, bishop b5 check, bishop takes c5, f takes e5, and rook d8. This is actually a position where, you know, black's king is completely safe, and black also has a pawn for the exchange, but this rook is invading, the bishop is also in the game, and black is actually definitely for choice here. I mean, the line continues a bit, and the computer actually doesn't give white a losing position, but I think in a practical game, white would lose this like 9 times out of 10, just because to defend this would be very difficult. You have to constantly worry about checks on the second rank, checks on to f4 and the dark square diagonal, and if one of these pawns drops off the board, the material's equal, and maybe the c pawn or the e pawn could be a runner. So all those factors just make it a really, really tough position to survive. Instead, though, I played the move bishop e4, and now white played rook e1. And again, I played bishop c2 and moved the bishop away because I was not enthusiastic about rook takes c4 exchange sacrifices and then rook e3. So I went bishop c2, and then after rook c3, kind of an interesting move because you could see that I can't take on c3 because queen takes c3 check would earn white 2 bishops for the rook. Now I went bishop takes a4, and I thought that this was a really, really nice tactic and that I definitely won the game, to be honest. Because here I was like, well, look at this. I've gotten a pawn for free because if you can't go queen takes a4 because of bishop takes c3 now. And essentially I would be 2 pawns up with a much better structure and a safer king. So I thought that my maneuver with bishop c2 and bishop takes a4 meant that my bishop would come to b5. I would now have 2 pawns for the exchange, which would mean even material, and I thought the game would just be over. I'd just mop up. But amazingly here, this whole sequence with bishop c2 and bishop takes a4 actually throws away any winning chances I'd had. And the reason is that even though I have all these pawns, black actually lacks dark square control. So even with the dark square bishop, white is the one that's actually controlling a lot of the dark squares in the position, and it actually gives white enough counterplay to offset the pawn deficit. And so look what happens in the next few moves, because it's quite a remarkable transformation, and I was just shocked that I couldn't make hay of it. So white played the move bishop e5, and this is actually by far the best move in the position. And I was actually quite impressed that he found this, because even though we made the control, he'd thought for like 15, 20 minutes into it, so he was really already back in time trouble again. Bishop e5 is a really good move because it actually gets rid of the one dark square defender I had, and it actually now calls into question the bishop on a4. So really, really good move. I played bishop takes e5, and now white played f takes e5. And here we can see part of the problem is that this one pawn on e5 essentially controls 3 black pawns. It controls g6, f7, and e6. And essentially, as long as the queens are on the board, I'm not gonna be able to push the f pawn because it would just weaken my king too much. And so really, I have to play around my pawns, but I can't actually push a lot of them. And it's the same thing with my queenside pawns. Like c6 and a6 are kind of immobilized by white's pawns. So really, the only pawn in my position that can kind of do anything by itself is the d pawn, but really it can't run up the board by itself unsupported by the e or c pawn. So basically, even though I have 2 pawns for the exchange, and it would seem that this position just is like overwhelmingly better for black, it's actually not, because white actually now has 2 open files for the rooks and really good dark square control. And I just misevaluated this position from afar. I thought this one would be an easy one to win, because I thought, okay, if I'm able to trade the queens, surely these pawns will just drop off. But it just was not that simple. I started with the move bishop b5 just to stop the rook from getting to f1 and protecting my own bishop. And I thought, this is good, because now it meant that white couldn't double on the f-file. And I thought, okay, this should be good for me. But now white played rook g3, and already I started to feel a little bit of the pressure, because all of a sudden this queen now can actually shift to e3 and very quickly shift over to some of the dark squares on the king side. I played queen e7, shifting my queen over to the dark squares, hoping that, this would be a nice consolidation. And now white went rook g4, and this is actually a really, really clever decision, and a subtle one at that, because it does two things. First of all, it covers the h4 square, so it doesn't allow my queen to infiltrate there, or my rook for that matter. But the other thing it does is it actually introduces an Alekhine's gun on the g file, and that's actually the file that white can actually make use of all the heavy pieces, because my bishop doesn't control, it does control f1, but it doesn't control any squares on the g file. So all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, like what's happening? Because white can very quickly get the pressure on the g file, and it's not so clear where my counterplay is coming from. And I actually thought for a second, am I actually losing here? Because I just did not see where my counterplay was coming from. I played the move rook h5, trying to shift my rook over through the 5th rank and get activity like that. But now white played the move queen g3, and it was quite clear that, again, white is the one that's kind of, manning the king side more effectively than I am, and my bishop on b5 really can't participate. It has no way to, enter and support the fray. If this bishop on b5 was actually on f5, black would have a great position. But it's really one of the huge problems here is my bishop on b5 actually is just not in the game, and so black's actually kind of a piece down on the king side. I now played rook f5 because I thought that was, again, the next best thing I could do is to shift the rook over. But now white played rook g1, and I understood here that I was not better at all, because now there's the threat of rook takes g6, and it's just impossible to stop. And unfortunately, my king can't really run away in time. So, yeah, I just actually can't really stop it. I played king f8 just to not allow rook takes g6 with check. But now after rook takes g6, f takes g6, and queen takes g6, white has actually given up a piece, but I only have one check, and white's immediate threat is queen g8 mate. But you can also see that my king actually can't move, and so I just have some big problems here. And the other issue is that queen h6 check is also an idea if my queen moves away, picking up the queen for the rook. And so I recognized here that I would wind up having to give up my queen to kind of save my king here, but no winning chances at all, and no winning chances for me, and that kind of disappointed me, because I'd thought that when I'd won that second pawn for the exchange, it would have been smooth sailing. After queen g6, I went rook f2 check, king h1 was played, and then I went queen f7, and this move gives my king the e7 square, but it also runs my queen. It means that my queen's going to be offered up for the white rook, because now white went queen h6 check, and the point is that, after king e8, queen h8 check, and king d7, there's rook g7, and my queen is going to be lost. Fortunately for me, all my pawns are well protected right now, and my bishop is protected, and this king is actually quite exposed, so I didn't really think I had serious chances of losing here, but I also didn't want to kind of, test it because white has an h-pawn that might be a little bit dangerous when the queen comes off the board. So I decided to actually, go for the repetition here and played rook f1 check, and then after king g2, rook f2, king g1, rook f1, we actually repeated, and the game ended in a draw. Very, very interesting game, just because I think I really didn't play well, but I didn't lose, and I think that was important. That was like the bright side you could look at. The opening really didn't go well. White essentially got very, very nice pressure on my position, particularly on the queen side after I played the c5 break. And I did well and was resourceful defending, giving up the exchange, seeing that my bishops gave me some compensation for it. But, when the moment came to take my chance and actually seize the initiative in the center with d4, I missed it on several occasions. And I think it actually kind of taught me that, I need to push my pawns in the center because that was the thing that actually was justifying me down the exchange, was the fact that my pawns were so healthy and that I can actually use them. And you could see here in the final position, I actually never wound up using my d-pawn, which, probably says something about why the game was a draw and not something more. So just something to think about going into future games. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.